Nathaniel Riverstone's calloused hands froze mid-motion, the branding iron suspended inches from the calf's hide as the stranger's words cut through the Montana wind like a blade. The filthy boy beside the drunk wasn't livestock. He was reading the auction numbers, his lips moving silently through calculations no 11-year-old should know. Martha Jenkins dropped her bidding paddle, the wooden clatter echoing across the stunned crowd. A woman gasped behind him, recognizing something in the child's aristocratic bone structure beneath layers of prairie dirt and neglect. The boy's wrists bore rope burns, but his posture held the ghost of proper breeding. Nathaniel's chest tightened as memories of his own lost son crashed against the present moment. This wasn't right. Nothing about this broken child matched his supposed father's crude desperation. "Someone call Sheriff Morrison," Nathaniel commanded, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his gut. Who was this boy, and how long did they have before someone came looking for him? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The drunk swayed dangerously, whiskey fumes rolling off him in waves as he yanked the rope tighter around the boy's wrist. "Name's Jasper Coldwell," he slurred, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Boy ain't worth the beans it takes to feed him. Came out wrong from his ma, God rest her worthless soul." The child flinched but remained silent, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with an intelligence that made Nathaniel's skin crawl with unease. Sheriff Morrison pushed through the gathering crowd, his weathered face grim. "What's the commotion here, Nate?" But before Nathaniel could answer, the boy did something that stopped every heart in that dusty circle. He lifted his bound hands and traced numbers in the dirt, not random scratches, but precise mathematical equations that would challenge a schoolmaster. Martha Jenkins stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Sweet Mary and Joseph." "That child knows Latin." She pointed to where the boy had written veritas beneath his calculations. Truth. The word hung in the air like a prayer, or maybe a curse. Jasper Coldwell's face darkened, and he raised his hand to strike the boy. "Told you he's touched in the head. Does devils work with them numbers?" But Nathaniel caught the man's wrist before it could fall, his grip iron strong from years of ranch work. "Touch him and you'll answer to me," Nathaniel growled, his Civil War instincts flaring to life. Something about this whole scene stank worse than a 3-day-old carcass. No drunk could afford to keep a child this educated, this clean beneath the surface grime. The boy's fingernails were dirty, but his teeth were straight and white, the kind that came from years of proper care. The child looked up then, meeting Nathaniel's gaze with eyes the color of storm clouds. In that moment, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the desperate hope of two lost souls finding each other in the wilderness. The boy's lips moved soundlessly, forming words that made Nathaniel's blood run cold. "Help me." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. "Jasper, I'm going to need to see some papers on this boy. Birth certificate. Something that proves he's yours." The crowd murmured agreement, sensing the shift in the wind. But Coldwell was already backing toward his horse, dragging the boy with him. "Don't need papers for my own flesh and blood. Law says a man can sell what's his." The desperation in his voice betrayed him. This wasn't a father's anger, but a trapped animal's panic. Nathaniel's decision crystallized like ice forming on a winter pond. "I'll take him." The words escaped before his mind could catch up to his heart. "Whatever you're asking, I'll pay it." The boy's eyes widened, not with relief but with something deeper, a flicker of hope so fragile it might shatter if breathed upon too hard. The transaction happened faster than a summer storm, money changing hands while the boy stood silent as carved stone. $50, more than most men made in 3 months, disappeared into Jasper Coldwell's grimy palm. The drunk's eyes gleamed with greed and something else, something that made Nathaniel's gut twist with unease. Relief. The kind of relief a man felt when he'd just rid himself of evidence. "Pleasure doing business," Coldwell slurred, already backing toward his horse. "Don't say I didn't warn you when that boy brings nothing but trouble. Some children are born cursed, marked by the devil himself." He spat again, mounted his horse, and rode hard out of town without looking back, leaving nothing but dust and the lingering stench of whiskey and fear. Sheriff Morrison approached slowly, his weathered hand still resting on his gun. "Nate, you sure about this? That man was lying through his teeth about something, and now you're stuck with whatever mess he's left behind." The lawman's eyes studied the boy with professional suspicion. "Child, what's your real name?" The boy looked up at Nathaniel first, as if seeking permission to speak. When Nathaniel nodded encouragingly, the child's voice emerged like water from a deep well, clear, educated, and utterly at odds with his ragged appearance. "Benjamin, sir. Benjamin Ashford." The name hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that made Martha Jenkins gasp and cover her mouth. "Ashford?" Morrison's face went pale. "Boy, you wouldn't be talking about the Boston Ashfords, would you? The railroad family?" Benjamin nodded solemnly, and the sheriff's hand moved to his chest as if his heart had skipped a beat. "Sweet, merciful God, that family's been searching for their missing boy for near on 5 years. Posted rewards that could buy half of Montana territory." Nathaniel felt the world tilt beneath his boots. 5 years. This child had been missing for 5 years and somehow ended up in the hands of a drunk in the middle of nowhere. "How did you get here, son?" he asked gently, kneeling to meet Benjamin's eyes. "What happened to you?" The boy's face went blank, as if a curtain had been drawn across his memory. "I remember darkness, cold stone walls, a man with kind eyes who became cruel when the sun went down." His small hands trembled as he touched his throat. "He said my family was dead. Said no one would ever come looking for me because I wasn't worth finding." Tears traced clean paths through the dirt on his cheeks, and Nathaniel felt something crack open in his chest. Martha stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding her shock. "You poor lamb. When did you last have a proper meal?" She knelt beside Benjamin, her practiced eyes cataloging signs of long-term neglect. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his clothes hung loose on his small frame, the careful way he held himself as if expecting a blow. I don't remember," Benjamin whispered. "Time became strange in the dark place. Sometimes the cruel man would bring bread. Sometimes he would bring nothing but anger." His voice carried the weight of nightmares, of a childhood stolen and twisted into something unrecognizable. Sheriff Morrison was already moving toward his office. "I need to send telegrams. Boston, Denver, anywhere that might have word about this boy's disappearance. Nathaniel, you realize what you've stumbled into here. This isn't just about one missing child. This is about a crime that's been going on for years. Someone's been keeping this boy, and they sure as hell weren't planning to let him go free." The crowd began to disperse, but their whispers followed Nathaniel as he led Benjamin toward his wagon. "Poor little thing," one woman murmured. "Imagine what horrors he's seen." Another voice, harder and more suspicious. "What if it's a trick? What if someone's using that boy to get close to decent folks?" Benjamin heard the whispers too, his shoulders drawing up defensively. Nathaniel placed a protective hand on the child's back, feeling the sharp angles of ribs beneath the thin shirt. "Don't mind them, son. People fear what they don't understand, and right now you're a mystery wrapped in a puzzle." He helped Benjamin into the wagon, noting how the boy's hands shook as he gripped the wooden seat. As they rode toward Nathaniel's ranch, the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains. Benjamin sat quietly, his storm cloud eyes taking in the vast Montana landscape as if he'd never seen open sky before. "Sir?" he finally asked, his voice barely audible over the wagon wheels. "Why did you help me?" Nathaniel considered the question as he guided the horses along the familiar path. "I had a son once," he said finally. "Lost him to fever when he was about your age. Been wondering ever since what kind of man I might have become if I'd had someone to teach, someone to protect." He glanced at Benjamin, seeing something of his own lost boy in the child's serious expression. "Maybe God put you in my path for a reason, or maybe I just couldn't stomach watching a child suffer when I had the power to help." Benjamin nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to him. The cruel man used to say that suffering built character, that pain was a teacher. His small fists clenched in his lap. "I learned many lessons in the dark place, sir. I learned to be very quiet and very still, and very careful about what I said and when I said it." The words hit Nathaniel like physical blows. This child had been systematically broken, taught to fear his own voice and doubt his own worth. "Well, those lessons don't apply anymore," Nathaniel said firmly. "On my ranch, children are meant to run and shout and ask questions. They're meant to be loud and messy and full of joy." He saw Benjamin's eyes widen with something that might have been hope. "Think you can remember how to be a regular boy?" I'm not sure," Benjamin admitted. "The cruel man said I was special, that I had gifts that made me valuable, but also dangerous. He taught me numbers and letters because he said smart children brought better prices." The casual way he spoke of his own commodification made Nathaniel's hands tighten on the reins until his knuckles went white. As the ranch came into view, a modest spread with a sturdy house, weathered barn, and corrals filled with horses, Benjamin leaned forward with genuine interest. "You raise horses, sir?" "Among other things," Nathaniel replied, pleased to hear curiosity replacing fear in the boy's voice. "Got cattle, too, and chickens and a few pigs. It's not much, but it's home." He pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch, where his border collie, Scout, waited with tail wagging. "That there's Scout. He's friendly, but he'll bark at strangers until he gets to know them." Benjamin climbed down from the wagon with careful precision, every movement calculated and controlled. But when Scout bounded over to investigate, something magical happened. The dog seemed to sense the boy's fragility, approaching slowly with soft whines of sympathy. When Benjamin tentatively extended his hand, Scout gently licked his fingers, and for the first time since the auction, Benjamin smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. "He likes you," Nathaniel observed, climbing down from the driver's seat. "Scout's a good judge of character. If he trusts you, that's good enough for me." He shouldered Benjamin's meager bundle of belongings, everything the child owned could fit in a flour sack, and headed toward the house. "Come on, son. Let's get you fed and cleaned up. Tomorrow we'll start figuring out how to get you home to your family." But even as he spoke the words, Nathaniel felt a strange reluctance. After years of loneliness, of talking only to horses and cattle, he found himself already growing attached to this strange, damaged, brilliant child. Benjamin followed him toward the house, Scout trotting beside him like a faithful guardian, and for the first time in 5 long years, the ranch felt like it might become a home again. The interior of Nathaniel's house told the story of a man who had stopped living and started merely existing. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon light, streaming through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. A single plate sat on the kitchen table, flanked by 1 cup and 1 fork, the table setting of profound loneliness. Benjamin's educated eyes took in the sparse furnishings, the cold fireplace, the silence that seemed to press against the walls like a living thing. "It's not much," Nathaniel said, suddenly self-conscious about the bachelor starkness of his home. Haven't had reason to make it fancy. He watched Benjamin examine a daguerreotype on the mantelpiece. A young woman holding a baby, both frozen in sepia tones of a happier time. That's my Mary and little James. Fever took them both while I was off fighting at Antietam. Benjamin studied the photograph with the intensity of someone who understood loss intimately. She has kind eyes, he said softly. Like yours. I remember kind eyes from before the darkness. A woman who smelled like roses and sang songs in a language I didn't understand. His small hand traced the air as if following a melody only he could hear. Sometimes I dream I can still hear her singing, but when I wake up, there's only silence. The raw pain in the child's voice made Nathaniel's chest tighten. He moved to the kitchen, more to have something to do with his hands than from any real purpose. How about we get some food in you? I've got beans and cornbread, maybe some bacon if it hasn't gone bad. He busied himself with the stove, aware that Benjamin was watching his every movement with the hyper-vigilant attention of someone who had learned to read danger in the smallest gestures. While Nathaniel cooked, Benjamin wandered the small house like a ghost learning to haunt. He paused at the bookshelf, running his fingers along the worn spines with reverence. "You have Dickens," he said with surprise. "And Shakespeare. The cruel man had books too, but he only let me read the ones about punishment and suffering. He said happy stories made children weak." Nathaniel looked up from the beans he was stirring. "You can read any book in this house, son. Knowledge isn't meant to be a weapon, it's meant to be a gift." He pulled down a volume of poetry, its leather binding soft with age. This was Mary's favorite. She used to read to little James every night before bed. Said stories were food for the soul. Benjamin accepted the book with trembling hands, opening it carefully as if it might crumble at his touch. His eyes widened as he found a pressed flower between the pages, delicate petals still holding the ghost of their original color. "She marked her favorite passages," he whispered, seeing the faint pencil marks in the margins. "She wrote notes to herself." "Read them if you want," Nathaniel said gently. Mary always said books were meant to be shared, not hoarded. He turned back to the stove, but his ears caught the sound of Benjamin's voice as the boy began to read aloud, not the words of the poem, but Mary's handwritten observations. The child's pronunciation was flawless, his inflection suggesting an education far beyond his years. As they sat down to eat, Benjamin's table manners revealed another piece of the puzzle. He waited for Nathaniel to begin, folded his napkin properly in his lap, and ate with the careful precision of someone trained in etiquette. But underneath the polished surface, Nathaniel could see the telltale signs of a child who had known hunger. The way Benjamin's eyes tracked every bite, the slight hesitation before swallowing, as if part of him couldn't quite believe the food wouldn't be taken away. "Benjamin," Nathaniel said carefully, "can you tell me about your family? Your real family, before the dark place?" He kept his voice gentle, non-threatening, the way he might approach a spooked horse. The boy's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "I remember a big house with marble floors that echoed when you walked, gardens with fountains that sang day and night. A grandmother who wore pearls and smelled like lavender." His eyes grew distant, lost in memories that seemed more like dreams. "She used to let me play her piano, even though I was supposed to be studying with my tutors." "Piano?" Nathaniel's eyebrows rose. "You can play piano?" Benjamin nodded, then seemed to catch himself, as if admitting to the skill might be dangerous. "The cruel man said it was a useless talent. He said music made people soft, made them forget their place in the world." He set down his fork, his appetite apparently fled. "But sometimes, in the darkest nights, I would play songs in my head. It was the only way to remember that I used to be someone else." After dinner, Nathaniel led Benjamin upstairs to what had once been his son's room. The space remained exactly as it had been 5 years ago, a shrine to a childhood cut short. Toy soldiers marched across the windowsill, a wooden rocking horse waited patiently in the corner, and children's books lined the shelves like loyal sentinels. Benjamin stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the tangible presence of another child's interrupted life. "This was James's room," Nathaniel said quietly. "You can sleep here tonight, if you're comfortable with it. I understand if it feels strange." He watched Benjamin's reaction carefully, ready to offer alternatives if the weight of another child's tragedy proved too much. But Benjamin stepped into the room with something approaching reverence. He touched the carved wooden horse, picked up a tin soldier, and examined it with careful attention. "He was loved," Benjamin said with certainty. "I can feel it in everything here. The cruel man's house was cold, even when there were fires in every room. But this—" He looked up at Nathaniel with those storm cloud eyes. "This room remembers joy." That night, as Benjamin washed with the hot water Nathaniel had heated, the true extent of his ordeal became visible. Faded bruises yellowed his ribs, and old scars told stories of systematic cruelty. But most disturbing were the marks on his wrists, not just from the ropes, but older marks that spoke of prolonged restraint. Nathaniel felt a cold rage building in his chest, the kind of fury that had once driven him through Confederate lines with nothing but a bayonet and righteous anger. "Benjamin," he said carefully as the boy changed into one of James's old nightshirts, "when you're ready to talk about what happened to you, really talk about it, I'll listen. But until then, you're safe here. No one will hurt you on my land." He meant every word, and something in his voice must have conveyed that certainty because Benjamin's shoulders relaxed for the first time since the auction. As Nathaniel tucked the boy into James's bed, Benjamin caught his hand. "Sir? Nathaniel?" The boy's voice was small in the darkness. "What if my real family doesn't want me back? What if they think I'm broken now, too damaged to be their son?" The fear in his voice was heartbreaking. Not the fear of physical pain, but the deeper terror of rejection and abandonment. Nathaniel sat on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. "Son, any family worth having would cross hell itself to get you back. And if they can't see past whatever's been done to you to find the brave, intelligent boy underneath, then they don't deserve you." He smoothed the blanket with hands that had learned gentleness late in life. "But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Tonight, you just rest." But as Nathaniel made his way downstairs, he found himself hoping, selfishly, that Benjamin's family might take their time in coming forward. For the first time in 5 years, his house felt alive again. The silence no longer pressed against him like a weight. It felt peaceful, expectant, full of possibility. He settled into his chair by the cold fireplace, Mary's book of poetry in his lap, and listened to the sound of another person breathing upstairs. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of change. In Boston, telegraph lines hummed with urgent messages. And somewhere in the darkness, forces that had kept Benjamin Ashford captive for 5 long years began to stir, sensing that their carefully constructed web of secrets was about to unravel. Dawn broke over the Montana territory with a kind of crystalline clarity that made promises seem possible. Nathaniel woke to sounds he hadn't heard in his house for 5 years, the tentative footsteps of someone trying not to wake a sleeping household, the careful clink of dishes being handled with unfamiliar reverence. He found Benjamin in the kitchen, having somehow managed to start the fire and set water to boil without making a sound. "Morning, son," Nathaniel said softly, not wanting to startle the boy. Benjamin turned, and in the morning light, cleaned of yesterday's grime, The child's aristocratic features were unmistakable. High cheekbones, a straight nose, and those remarkable storm-gray eyes that seemed to hold depths far beyond his 11 years. "You didn't need to tend the fire. That's my job." Benjamin's hands fluttered nervously at his sides. "I'm sorry, sir. In the dark place, if I didn't wake before him, there would be consequences." Old habits die hard. He gestured toward the table where he'd arranged a simple breakfast with mathematical precision, each item placed at exact angles, each distance measured. "I thought perhaps I could earn my keep. I don't wish to be a burden." The formal speech patterns, the ingrained servility, the bone-deep fear of being unwanted, every word cut into Nathaniel's heart like a blade. "Benjamin, listen to me carefully. You are not a servant here. You're not earning anything because you don't owe me anything. You're a child who deserves care simply because you exist." He sat down at the table, deliberately disturbing the perfect arrangement to make a point. "Can you try to remember what it felt like to be a child?" Before Benjamin could answer, Scout began barking frantically from the front porch. Nathaniel's hand instinctively went to the rifle mounted above the fireplace as hoofbeats thundered up the drive. Through the window he could see a lone rider approaching fast, dust billowing behind him like a storm cloud. Benjamin had gone pale as winter bone, his small body trembling with barely controlled terror. "The cruel man found me," Benjamin whispered, backing against the far wall. "He always said he would find me if I tried to run. He said there was nowhere in the world I could hide." The child's breathing became shallow and rapid, his eyes darting around the room as if seeking escape routes. Sheriff Morrison burst through the door without knocking, his face grim with urgency. "Nate, we got trouble coming down the mountain. Big trouble." He paused when he saw Benjamin cowering in the corner, and his expression softened momentarily. "Morning, son. Don't be afraid. I'm here to help." But when he turned back to Nathaniel, his lawman's mask returned. "Got 3 telegrams back from Boston overnight. That boy's disappearance sparked the biggest manhunt in Massachusetts history. The Ashford family's been turning over every stone from here to California." Nathaniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. "That's good news, isn't it? His family wants him back." But even as he spoke the words, he knew from Morrison's expression that the situation was far more complicated than a simple reunion. "Here's where it gets thorny," Morrison continued, pulling out a worn telegram. "Eleanor Ashford, that's the boy's grandmother and head of the family fortune. She's been getting reports from confidence men and fraudsters for 5 years. Dozens of families claimed they had her missing grandson, all looking for the reward money." He looked directly at Benjamin, who was listening with the intense focus of someone whose life might depend on every word. "She stopped believing any of them are real." Benjamin stepped forward, his child's voice steady despite his trembling hands. "What does the telegram say about me specifically?" The question was asked with the precision of someone accustomed to parsing legal documents, another clue to his sophisticated upbringing. Morrison unfolded the yellow paper. "Says here that Eleanor Ashford's representative will arrive within the week to investigate this latest claim. But Nate—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The representative isn't family. It's a man named Cornelius Ashford, the boy's great-uncle. And according to Boston police, he's been the most vocal about these false claims being a waste of time and resources." The name hit Benjamin like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face draining of what little color it had regained. "Uncle Cornelius," he breathed, and the way he said it made both men's blood run cold. He visited the dark place sometimes. He would stand in the shadows and watch while I was being taught my lessons." Benjamin's hands went to his throat, as if reliving some horror too terrible to speak aloud. Nathaniel was across the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside the trembling child. "Benjamin, look at me. Look right at me." When the boy's unfocused eyes met his, Nathaniel spoke with quiet authority. "Whatever happened before, whoever hurt you, they can't touch you now. I won't let them." But even as he made the promise, he wondered if it was one he could keep. Morrison's face had gone pale as he pieced together the implications. "Sweet Jesus, are you saying this Cornelius Ashford was involved in your disappearance?" The sheriff's hand moved instinctively to his gun. "Son, I need you to tell me everything you remember about this man. Everything." Benjamin began to speak in a monotone, as if reciting facts would somehow make them less painful. He wasn't supposed to be there. The cruel man would get nervous when Uncle Cornelius visited, would clean me up and make me recite lessons, poetry, mathematics, languages. Uncle Cornelius would nod and say I was developing nicely. The child's voice dropped to a whisper. "Once I heard them arguing about money. The cruel man said keeping me was expensive, that he deserved more compensation for the risk. Uncle Cornelius said patience would be rewarded when the old woman finally died." The puzzle pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Cornelius Ashford hadn't been searching for his missing nephew. He'd been the architect of the boy's disappearance. With Benjamin presumed dead, Cornelius would inherit the family fortune when Eleanor passed. But now, with the boy potentially surfacing alive, that inheritance was threatened. "He's not coming here to verify Benjamin's identity," Nathaniel said grimly. "He's coming to make sure there's no identity to verify." The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Not only was he harboring a missing child, but that child was the target of a conspiracy that reached from Montana territory all the way to Boston's highest society. Benjamin seemed to understand the danger as clearly as the adults. "He'll kill me," he said, with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had lived with death as a constant companion. "And he'll kill anyone who tries to protect me. That's why the cruel man was so frightened of him. Uncle Cornelius doesn't leave loose ends." Morrison was already moving toward the door. "I'm riding to town to send telegrams to the federal marshals. This is bigger than local law can handle." He paused at the threshold. "Nate, pack light and pack fast. You and the boy need to disappear until I can get proper protection out here." Cornelius Ashford has money, which means he has men, and men with nothing to lose are the most dangerous kind. As the sheriff rode away in a cloud of dust, Nathaniel began pulling supplies from his shelves with military efficiency. But Benjamin remained frozen in place, staring out the window toward the mountains. "Sir," the boy said quietly, "what if we can't outrun them? What if Uncle Cornelius finds us anyway?" Nathaniel paused in his packing, looking at this remarkable child who had already survived 5 years of hell and was now facing the prospect of more. "Then we'll face whatever comes together," he said simply. "I made you a promise, Benjamin. I intend to keep it, no matter what it costs me." Outside, the Montana sky remained deceptively peaceful, but both man and boy could feel the storm approaching. Somewhere to the east, Cornelius Ashford was already making preparations for his journey west, and his intentions were far deadlier than a simple family reunion. The race for Benjamin's life had begun, and the stakes were higher than either of them fully understood. Within an hour, Nathaniel had transformed from a settled rancher into a man preparing for war. He loaded his saddlebags with ammunition, dried meat, and enough supplies to last a week in the wilderness. Benjamin watched with the quiet intensity of someone who had learned that survival often depended on memorizing every detail of an escape plan. "We'll head into the crazy mountains," Nathaniel explained, checking his rifle one final time. "There are old mining camps up there, abandoned since the silver played out. We can hole up until Morrison gets federal help." He paused, studying Benjamin's pale face. "You ever been on horseback before, son?" Benjamin nodded, then hesitated. "Before the dark place, I had riding lessons. English saddle, proper form." His voice carried the ghost of pride, quickly suppressed. "But it's been 5 years." "I may have forgotten." Nathaniel saddled his gentlest mare, a bay named Patience, who had the temperament of a grandmother and the sure-footedness of a mountain goat. "Riding's like reading. Once you learn, your body remembers even when your mind thinks it's forgotten." He helped Benjamin into the saddle, noting how the boy's hands naturally found the correct position on the reins despite his claimed uncertainty. They were leading their horses from the barn when Scout's ears pricked forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. From the eastern horizon, a dust cloud was approaching, too large for a single rider, too organized for a casual group of travelers. Nathaniel's blood turned to ice water as he counted at least 6 horsemen riding hard toward his ranch. "They're early," Benjamin whispered, his face draining of color. "Uncle Cornelius always said patience was for the weak." He must have been traveling already when the telegram was sent. The boy's hands began to shake so violently that Patience stamped nervously beneath him. "Sir, you should leave me. Take your horse and ride north. I'll tell them you were never here." The suggestion hit Nathaniel like a slap. "Benjamin Ashford, you listen to me right now. I didn't fight through 3 years of war just to abandon a child when things got dangerous." He mounted his own horse, a powerful stallion named Thunder, who could outrun most anything on 4 legs. "We ride together, or we don't ride at all." They urged their horses into the tree line just as the first riders crested the hill. Even from a distance, Nathaniel could see these weren't local men. Their clothes were too fine, their horses too expensive, and they rode with the disciplined formation of professional gunmen. At their head rode a tall man in a black coat, his silver hair gleaming in the morning sun like polished metal. "That's him," Benjamin breathed, his voice barely audible over the thunder of hoofbeats. "That's Uncle Cornelius." The boy's entire body had begun to tremble, not with fear, but with something deeper. A bone-deep terror that spoke of systematic psychological torture. "He used to tell me stories about children who disappointed him. What happened to their bodies? Where he buried the pieces." Nathaniel guided them deeper into the forest, following game trails that wound between towering pines and granite outcroppings. Behind them, they could hear shouts as the riders discovered the empty ranch house. Doors slammed, glass shattered, and then came the sound that made both of them flinch, the deliberate, methodical destruction of everything Nathaniel had built over 15 years of solitary labor. "They're sending a message," Nathaniel said grimly, recognizing the tactics from his military days. "Scorched earth. They want us to know there's nothing left to come back to." He felt a stab of grief for his simple life, his quiet routines, his precious few mementos of Mary and James. But when he looked at Benjamin's stricken face, the loss seemed bearable. "It's just things, son. Things can be replaced. People can't." They rode in silence for an hour, climbing steadily into the foothills where the air grew thin and the trees grew scarce. Benjamin proved to be a natural horseman despite his years of captivity, his body remembering skills his mind had tried to forget. But as they paused to rest the horses beside a mountain stream, the boy finally broke down. "This is my fault," he sobbed, his careful composure finally cracking. "You had a life, a home, and I've ruined everything. Uncle Cornelius was right. I bring destruction to everyone who tries to help me." The words poured out like blood from a wound, 5 years of programmed self-hatred spilling into the mountain air. "Maybe I should just go back. Maybe if I cooperate, he'll leave you alone." Nathaniel dismounted and pulled Benjamin from his saddle, holding the trembling child against his chest. "Stop that talk right now. You didn't choose any of this, Benjamin. You were a 6-year-old boy when they stole you from your family. Nothing that's happened since then is your fault." He felt the boy's tears soaking through his shirt, hot and desperate. Evil men did evil things, and now they're trying to finish what they started. But they're not going to win. As if summoned by his words, the sound of pursuing hoofbeats echoed through the canyon below them. Cornelius and his men had picked up their trail with the efficiency of professional manhunters. Nathaniel could see them now, dark figures moving through the trees like hunting wolves, methodically following every broken branch and disturbed stone. "How many men does he have with him?" Nathaniel asked, helping Benjamin back onto his horse. The boy wiped his eyes and tried to count the distant riders. 6, maybe 7, but sir, Nathaniel, these aren't ordinary hired guns. Uncle Cornelius only employs men with nothing left to lose. Veterans from both sides of the war, men who've done things that keep them awake at night. Benjamin's voice carried the weight of overheard conversations, of a child forced to understand adult cruelties far too young. "He pays them enough to disappear after the job is done. Clean. No witnesses, no loose ends." They pushed their horses harder, climbing toward the abandoned mining camp that Nathaniel remembered from his younger days. The Silver Bell mine had once employed 200 men, but when the ore played out, the workers had simply walked away, leaving behind a ghost town of empty buildings and rusted equipment. It would provide shelter, but more importantly, it would give them the high ground. As they climbed, Benjamin began to speak in a voice so quiet Nathaniel had to strain to hear him over the wind. "In the dark place, Uncle Cornelius would visit on my birthday every year. He called it his investment assessment. He would bring cake and presents, would pretend to be kind." The boy's hands tightened on his reins. "But then he would ask the cruel man questions. Had I grown properly? Was I learning at the expected rate? Did I remember anything inconvenient about my old life?" "And if the answers weren't satisfactory?" Nathaniel asked, though he dreaded the response. Benjamin's voice dropped to a whisper. "There was a cellar beneath the cellar, darker than dark. He would leave me there for days, sometimes weeks, with nothing but water and his voice coming through the walls, telling me I was worthless, that my real family was grateful I was gone, that the only reason I was alive was because he hadn't decided whether killing me was worth the effort." The Silver Bell mine came into view just as the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows between the abandoned buildings. The main structure was a 3-story wooden building that had once housed the mine offices, built into the mountainside for protection from winter storms. Perfect defensive position, assuming they could reach it before their pursuers caught up. But as they approached the mining camp, Scout began growling again. The hair on the back of Nathaniel's neck stood up as he realized their mistake. This hadn't been a chase, it had been a herding. Cornelius Ashford was too smart to simply follow them blindly through mountain passes. He'd anticipated their destination and sent men ahead to cut off their escape route. "Welcome to Silver Bell, Uncle Nate," came a voice from the shadows of the main building. A man stepped into the sunlight, rifle trained on them with practiced ease. "Mr. Ashford thought you might head this way. He remembers you mentioning this place in one of your letters to the boy's dear departed father." The gunman's smile was cold as winter steel. "He's very thorough about research, is Mr. Ashford. Knows all about your war record, your dead family, your pathetic, lonely life." Benjamin sat frozen in his saddle, staring at the rifle pointed at Nathaniel's chest. "Please," he whispered, his child's voice carrying across the empty camp. "Please don't hurt him. I'll come willingly. I'll do whatever Uncle Cornelius wants. Just don't hurt the man who tried to save me." The gunman's finger tightened on the trigger as Nathaniel slowly raised his hands, his mind racing through tactical possibilities. Behind him, he could hear Benjamin's ragged breathing. the boy fighting to contain sobs that might provoke their captor into violence. The abandoned mining camp stretched around them like a maze of shadows and broken dreams, each building a potential shelter or trap. "Easy now," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying the calm authority he'd learned commanding troops under fire. "No need for anyone to get hurt here. We're just travelers passing through." But even as he spoke, his eyes were cataloging details. The gunman's stance suggested military training. His rifle was well maintained, but his boots showed wear from hard riding, and most importantly, he kept glancing toward the main building as if expecting orders. "Don't insult my intelligence, Riverstone," the man replied, though his eyes flickered with uncertainty at Nathaniel's composed demeanor. "Mr. Ashford knows exactly who you are and what you're carrying. That boy's worth more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes, assuming you live long enough to spend it." His rifle barrel never wavered, but sweat was beginning to bead on his forehead despite the mountain chill. From somewhere deeper in the camp came the sound of approaching horses, Cornelius and the rest of his men closing their trap. Benjamin slumped in his saddle as if all the fight had drained out of him, and when he spoke his voice carried the defeated tone of someone who had never really believed escape was possible. "It's over, isn't it?" Benjamin whispered, not to Nathaniel but to the wind itself. 5 years of darkness, and now 5 more minutes of light before it all ends. The boy's hands moved to remove something from inside his shirt, a small object wrapped in cloth that he'd kept hidden throughout their flight. "At least I got to remember what kindness felt like." "Thank you for that, Nathaniel." The gunman's attention shifted momentarily to Benjamin's movement, and in that split second of distraction, Nathaniel saw his chance. 20 years of ranch work had made his reflexes quick and his movement sure. He threw himself sideways from his horse, rolling behind a rusted ore cart as the rifle cracked like thunder in the thin mountain air. The bullet sparked off metal inches from his head, but he was already moving, using the mining equipment as cover. "Run, Benjamin!" Nathaniel shouted, drawing his own pistol. "Take patience and ride north. Don't stop until you reach the territorial marshal's office in Helena." But when he looked back, the boy hadn't moved. Benjamin sat frozen on his horse, staring not at the gunman but at the main building where a tall figure in black had emerged. Cornelius Ashford stepped into the afternoon sunlight, like a character from Benjamin's worst nightmares given flesh. He was a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of refined features that suggested generations of good breeding. But his eyes held a coldness that made winter seem warm, and when he smiled at Benjamin, it was the expression of a collector admiring a particularly valuable specimen. "Hello, nephew," Cornelius said, his cultured Boston accent a jarring contrast to the wild Montana setting. "You've led us quite a chase. I trust you remember your manners well enough to come down from that horse and greet your family properly." He gestured with a leather-gloved hand, the movement casual but carrying undeniable authority. Benjamin's entire body began to shake, but he dismounted with the mechanical obedience of someone whose will had been systematically broken over years of conditioning. "Hello, Uncle Cornelius," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry for the trouble I've caused." The formal word seemed to cost him tremendous effort, as if each syllable was weighted with lead. "Sorry." Cornelius laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "My dear boy, you haven't caused trouble. You've provided entertainment. Did you really think you could disappear into this wilderness and start a new life? Did you imagine that crude frontier hospitality could protect you from family obligations?" His gaze shifted to the ore cart where Nathaniel crouched, wounded but still dangerous. "And you, Mr. Riverstone, my research suggests you're a man of honor, albeit misguided honor. Surely you understand that blood trumps charity." Nathaniel rose from cover, his pistol trained on Cornelius despite the 3 other rifles now pointed at his chest. "I understand that some blood's poison," he replied grimly. And I understand that a man who'd torment a child for money isn't worthy of the air he breathes. His finger found the trigger, steady despite the pain radiating from the graze across his ribs. Such melodrama. Cornelius sighed, pulling out a gold pocket watch and checking the time with theatrical precision. "Mr. Riverstone, let me explain the situation in terms your frontier mind can grasp. Benjamin is not your son, not your responsibility, and certainly not your property. He is the sole heir to the Ashford fortune, a position that comes with certain obligations. Obligations that require his continued cooperation and discretion." Benjamin took a halting step forward, his storm-gray eyes meeting Nathaniel's with desperate intensity. "Don't die for me," he pleaded, his child's voice cracking with emotion. "Please, I couldn't bear knowing that someone else suffered because of who I am." He turned to face his uncle, squaring his narrow shoulders with heartbreaking dignity. "I'll come with you willingly, Uncle Cornelius. I'll sign whatever papers you need. Just let him ride away." "Ah, there's the obedient boy I remember," Cornelius smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Such a quick learner. 5 years of proper education have served you well." He gestured to his men, who began closing in from multiple directions. "Unfortunately, Mr. Riverstone has seen too much and knows too much. Dead heroes tell no tales, and living witnesses have such inconvenient memories." The tactical situation was hopeless. Nathaniel was outnumbered 4-1, wounded and running low on ammunition. But as he watched Benjamin's shoulders slump in defeat, he felt the same cold fury that had driven him through the hell of Antietam and Chancellorsville. Some fights were worth losing if you could inflict enough damage on the way down. "Benjamin," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the camp. "That thing you pulled from your shirt, what is it?" The boy looked confused by the seemingly irrelevant question, but Nathaniel pressed on. "Show me, son. Show everyone what you've been carrying all this time." With trembling fingers, Benjamin unwrapped the cloth bundle, revealing a small daguerreotype in a silver frame. Even from a distance, Nathaniel could see it was a family portrait. A distinguished older woman, a younger man, and a small boy with unmistakable storm-gray eyes. "It's my grandmother," Benjamin said quietly. "Eleanor Ashford. She gave it to me on my 6th birthday, the day before I disappeared." Cornelius's composed facade cracked for just a moment, his eyes widening with what might have been panic before his mask of control reasserted itself. "Sentimental trash," he said dismissively, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Family photographs mean nothing." Any confidence man could have provided such a prop. "Could they have provided this?" Benjamin asked, turning the photograph over to reveal an inscription on the back. His voice grew stronger as he read aloud. "To my dearest Benjamin, may you always remember that love is the only fortune worth inheriting. Your devoted grandmother, Eleanor Ashford, September 15th, 1882. He looked directly at his uncle. "The day before someone arranged for me to disappear during a carriage ride to the park." The silence stretched between them like a taut rope ready to snap. Cornelius's men shifted uneasily, sensing their employer's discomfort. In the distance, the sound of approaching horses grew louder, too many horses to be coincidental travelers. Nathaniel felt a grim smile touch his lips as he recognized the disciplined pace of military riders. "Expecting more company, Cornelius?" Nathaniel asked, raising his voice to carry over the sound of hoofbeats. "Because unless I'm mistaken, that's the territorial marshal and a federal posse heading this way. Seems Sheriff Morrison's telegrams reached the right people after all." The approaching hoofbeats thundered through the canyon like an avalanche of justice, and Cornelius Ashford's carefully constructed plan began to crumble like a house built on sand. His hired guns shifted nervously, their rifles wavering between Nathaniel and the sound of what was clearly a substantial force of lawmen riding hard toward the abandoned mining camp. The man who had seemed so confident moments before now looked like what he truly was, a cornered predator whose prey had suddenly grown teeth. "Federal Marshal Jake Patterson, Territorial Authority!" The voice boomed across the camp as 24 riders crested the ridge, their badges glinting in the afternoon sun. "This area is under federal jurisdiction. Drop your weapons and step away from the civilians." The marshal himself was a bear of a man with iron-gray hair and the kind of steady hands that came from 20 years of bringing order to lawless territories. Cornelius's face contorted with rage as he watched his carefully orchestrated plan dissolve. "You think badges will save you?" he snarled at Nathaniel, his cultured Boston accent sharpening with desperation. "I have connections in Washington. Senators who owe me favors, judges whose campaigns I've funded. This frontier justice charade won't stand against real power." But Benjamin stepped forward, his small frame somehow carrying more authority than his uncle's bluster. "Uncle Cornelius," he said quietly, his voice steady for the first time since the confrontation began. "You taught me that power without honor is just another form of weakness. And you taught me that lies always collapse under the weight of truth." He held up the daguerreotype, its silver frame catching the light. "Should I tell the federal marshal about the cellar beneath the cellar? About the birthday visits? About how you counted the years until Grandmother Eleanor's death like a miser counting coins?" The transformation in Cornelius was immediate and terrifying. The mask of civilized refinement fell away completely, revealing something savage and desperate underneath. "You ungrateful little bastard," he hissed, his hand moving toward the concealed weapon beneath his coat. 5 years I invested in keeping you alive, 5 years of paying that fool Coldwell to maintain my investment, and this is how you repay me?" Nathaniel saw the movement and reacted with the trained reflexes of a combat veteran, but Benjamin was closer. The boy threw himself forward just as Cornelius drew a small pistol, the kind of weapon a gentleman might carry for protection, but deadly at close range. The shot cracked through the mountain air, but Benjamin's desperate tackle had thrown off Cornelius's aim. "Benjamin!" Nathaniel roared, scrambling from behind his cover as federal marshals swarmed the camp. But the boy was moving, rolling away from his uncle with the desperate agility of someone who had learned to survive through speed and cunning. Cornelius raised the pistol again, his face twisted with the fury of a man whose life's work was crumbling around him. The second shot never came. Marshal Patterson's rifle spoke with the authority of frontier justice, and Cornelius Ashford spun around, his weapon flying from nerveless fingers as the bullet took him high in the shoulder. He dropped to his knees in the dust of the mining camp, blood seeping through his expensive coat, his eyes wide with the shock of a man who had never expected to face consequences for his actions. "Cornelius Ashford," Patterson said grimly, dismounting from his horse with practiced efficiency. "You're under federal arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy, and attempted murder." He gestured to his deputies, who moved to secure Cornelius's hired guns. Most of them dropped their weapons immediately, recognizing the futility of fighting 24 federal marshals. "Your friends in Washington might have influence, but they don't outrank a federal warrant signed by a territorial judge." Benjamin staggered to his feet, his small body shaking with exhaustion and emotional overload. Nathaniel reached him in 3 quick strides, pulling the boy into his arms and feeling the rapid flutter of a young heart that had seen too much violence for one lifetime. "It's over, son," Nathaniel whispered, his own voice rough with emotion. "It's finally over." But even as he spoke the words, Nathaniel knew they weren't entirely true. The immediate danger had passed, but Benjamin's real challenges were just beginning. How do you heal 5 years of systematic psychological torture? How do you rebuild a childhood that had been stolen and corrupted? How do you teach a boy to trust again when the adults in his life had failed him so catastrophically? Marshall Patterson approached them with the careful deliberation of a man who understood trauma. "Benjamin Ashford," he said gently, crouching down to the boy's eye level. "Your grandmother Eleanor has been looking for you every single day for 5 years. She never stopped believing you were alive, never stopped hoping you would come home." He pulled out a telegram from his coat pocket. "This came through just this morning. She's already on a train heading west, should be in Helena by tomorrow evening." Benjamin looked up from Nathaniel's protective embrace, his storm-gray eyes wide with wonder and fear in equal measure. She still wants me? Even after everything that's been done to me? Even after all the terrible things I've learned?" His voice carried the heartbreaking uncertainty of a child who had been convinced he was worthless for so long that love seemed like a foreign concept. "Son," Patterson said with gentle authority, "your grandmother has moved heaven and earth to find you. She's hired private detectives, posted rewards, and personally interviewed every false lead for 5 long years. When she gets that telegram saying you're alive and safe—" He paused, his own voice thickening with emotion. "Well, I've got 3 grandchildren of my own, and I can tell you that woman's heart is going to soar like an eagle." Cornelius, now having his wound roughly bandaged by a deputy, laughed bitterly from where he knelt in the dust. "The old woman's sentiment won't last once she sees what the boy's become," he sneered, blood flecking his lips. 5 years in that cellar have marked him, made him strange, fearful, broken. She'll take one look at her damaged goods and send him to an asylum where he belongs. The words hit Benjamin like physical blows, and Nathaniel felt the boy's body convulse with renewed terror. But Marshall Patterson stood up, his face dark with righteous anger, and delivered a backhanded slap across Cornelius's mouth that snapped the man's head sideways. "That's for speaking poison about a child," Patterson said coldly. "Deputy Williams, if Mr. Ashford says another word that isn't a direct answer to a lawful question, you have my permission to gag him." He turned back to Benjamin with infinite gentleness. "Boy, don't you listen to that snake's lies. Your grandmother Eleanor Ashford is a steel magnolia wrapped in silk and determination. She didn't build a railroad empire by giving up on things she loved." As the federal marshals organized their prisoners and prepared for the journey back to civilization, Nathaniel found himself facing the hardest moment of his life. Benjamin clung to him with desperate intensity, and the rancher realized that somewhere between the livestock auction and this abandoned mining camp, this damaged boy had become the son of his heart. "What happens now?" Benjamin whispered against Nathaniel's chest. "Do I have to go back to Boston? Do I have to leave you behind and pretend none of this happened?" The fear in his voice was palpable, the terror of a child who had finally found safety only to face losing it again. Nathaniel looked out over the Montana wilderness that had been his home for 15 years, then down at the boy who had given his life meaning again. "I don't know all the answers, Benjamin, but I know this. Whatever happens next, you won't face it alone. Whether that means I follow you to Boston or you eventually come back here, we're family now. The kind of family that's built on choice and love, not just blood and obligation." Marshall Patterson overheard the exchange and smiled for the first time since arriving at the mining camp. "Well now," he said thoughtfully, "seems to me like Eleanor Ashford might have some interesting decisions to make when she gets here. And from what I know of that lady, she's never been one to do things the conventional way." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the abandoned mining camp, a strange peace settled over the group. Justice had been served, family would soon be reunited, and a boy who had lived in darkness for 5 years was finally stepping back into the light. The Grand Helena Hotel had never hosted a reunion quite like this one. Eleanor Ashford arrived on the evening train like a force of nature compressed into the body of a 70-year-old woman, her silver hair pinned with military precision and her dark eyes blazing with the intensity of someone who had spent 5 years preparing for this moment. She stepped onto the platform surrounded by a small army of lawyers, doctors, and private detectives, but her attention focused immediately on the small figure standing beside Marshall Patterson. Benjamin had been scrubbed clean and dressed in new clothes purchased from the Helena General Store, but no amount of soap could wash away the wariness in his storm-gray eyes or the way he held himself like a creature ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. When Eleanor's gaze found his across the crowded platform, both grandmother and grandson froze as if time itself had stopped breathing. "My God," Eleanor whispered, her composed facade cracking for just a moment. "He has his grandfather's eyes, and his father's stubborn chin." She moved forward with measured steps, her years of Boston society training warring with the desperate need to gather her lost grandson into her arms. "Benjamin, do you remember me, child?" Benjamin took a half-step backward, instinctively seeking the protective presence of Nathaniel, who stood just behind him with his hat in his hands and uncertainty written across his weathered features. The boy's voice, when it came, was barely audible above the noise of the train station. "Grandmother Eleanor, you still want me? Even though I'm different now? Even though Uncle Cornelius said you were better off thinking I was dead?" The words hit Eleanor like physical blows, and for a moment the Iron Lady of Boston society looked every one of her 70 years. But then her spine straightened, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to moving mountains through sheer force of will. "Benjamin Ashford, you listen to me very carefully. You are my grandson, my blood, my heart walking around outside my body. There is nothing you could have become, nothing you could have done, and nothing that could have been done to you that would make me love you 1 ounce less." She knelt then, heedless of her expensive traveling dress and the dust of the train platform, bringing herself down to Benjamin's eye level. "I have spent every day for 5 years wondering if you were cold, if you were hungry, if you remembered that someone loved you desperately. The only thing that kept me sane was the belief that someday, somehow, you would come home to me." Benjamin's carefully constructed emotional walls began to crumble. His small body started to shake, and tears traced silver paths down his cheeks. "But I'm broken, grandmother. Uncle Cornelius and the cruel man, they taught me terrible things. They made me do things, say things. I'm not the same boy who disappeared from the carriage that day." Eleanor reached out with infinite gentleness, her gloved hands framing Benjamin's face with the reverence of someone handling precious crystal. "My darling boy, we are all broken in some way. The measure of a person isn't whether they've been damaged, but what they choose to do with the pieces." Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more power than any shout. "You survived. You endured 5 years of hell and came out the other side with your soul intact. That doesn't make you broken. That makes you a miracle." The reunion might have continued in private, but Eleanor's sharp eyes had already catalogued every person on that platform, and her attention fixed on Nathaniel with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. "You must be Mr. Riverstone," she said, rising gracefully to her full height. "I understand I owe you a debt that can never be repaid." Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny, acutely aware of his rough clothes and calloused hands in the presence of such refined elegance. "I just did what any decent man would do, ma'am. No debt required." But even as he spoke, his eyes never left Benjamin, and Eleanor noticed the protective way the rancher positioned himself near the boy. Any decent man would have called the authorities, Eleanor observed with the keen intelligence that had built a railroad empire. You chose to risk everything, your home, your life, your future, for a child you'd known for less than a week. That suggests either remarkable foolishness or remarkable character. She paused, studying the way Benjamin kept glancing back at Nathaniel for reassurance. From my grandson's behavior, I'm inclined to believe it's the latter. Dr. Marcus Webb, Eleanor's personal physician who had traveled from Boston specifically for this reunion, stepped forward with professional concern. Mrs. Ashford, perhaps we should retire to the hotel for a more thorough examination. The boy has clearly suffered significant trauma, and we need to assess both his physical and mental condition before making any long-term decisions. But Benjamin's reaction to the suggestion was immediate and visceral. He shrank back against Nathaniel, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "Please," he whispered, his voice thick with panic. "Not the examining room, not the questions and the probing and the measurements. I'll be good, I promise. I'll cooperate. Just don't leave me alone with the doctors." Eleanor's face went pale as she recognized the signs of systematic medical abuse. "What did they do to you, child?" "What kind of examinations?" Her voice carried a dangerous edge, the tone of a woman preparing to unleash legal and financial warfare on anyone who had harmed her grandson. "Uncle Cornelius brought doctors sometimes," Benjamin said, his words tumbling out in a rush of remembered terror. "They would measure me, test my reactions, document my progress like I was some kind of experiment. They said they were making sure I was developing properly, that I would be worth the investment when the time came." His small hands clenched into fists. "They had needles and instruments and charts where they recorded everything, every fear, every weakness, every way to control me." The revelation hit the assembled adults like a physical blow. Dr. Webb's face went ashen, Marshall Patterson swore under his breath, and Eleanor's composed mask slipped entirely, revealing the raw fury of a woman who had just learned the true extent of her grandson's suffering. "No more doctors," Eleanor declared, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "No more examinations, no more tests, no more treating you like a specimen to be studied." She looked directly at Benjamin, her eyes blazing with protective fire. "You are not an investment or an experiment. You are my grandson, and you will never again be subjected to anything that makes you feel less than human." But the emotional reunion was interrupted by a commotion near the hotel entrance. Sheriff Morrison approached at a rapid walk, his face grim with news that couldn't wait. "Mrs. Ashford, Marshall Patterson, we've got a problem. 2 of Cornelius's men broke jail during transport. Professional gunfighters named Dalton and Cross. They took horses and supplies, and they're heading this way." Eleanor's face hardened into an expression that would have made railroad barons tremble. "How long until they reach Helena?" she asked with the tactical precision of a military commander. 6 hours, maybe less if they're riding hard," Morrison replied. "They know this territory, and they know there's still money to be made if they can finish what Cornelius started." He looked directly at Benjamin, who had gone pale with renewed terror. "These aren't men who give up easy, and they've got nothing left to lose." Nathaniel stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. "Then we'd better be ready for them. Mrs. Ashford, with your permission, I'd like to suggest we move Benjamin somewhere secure and prepare for a fight." But even as he spoke, he could see the conflict in Eleanor's eyes, the struggle between keeping her grandson safe and exposing him to more violence. Benjamin, however, made the decision for all of them. Drawing on reserves of courage that 5 years of captivity hadn't been able to break, he straightened his small shoulders and looked each adult in the eye. "I won't run anymore," he said quietly. "I won't let bad men chase me from place to place for the rest of my life. If they want to finish this, then let's finish it. But we finish it together." The words hung in the evening air like a challenge, And Eleanor Ashford smiled for the first time since stepping off that train, a smile that promised her enemies that they had severely underestimated both her and her remarkable grandson. The Helena Hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into a fortress within 2 hours of Sheriff Morrison's warning. Eleanor Ashford's wealth had accomplished what frontier justice alone could not, turning a social gathering space into a defensible position worthy of military strategists. Heavy furniture barricaded the windows, armed guards positioned at every entrance, and enough firepower assembled to hold off a small army. Benjamin sat in the center of it all, no longer the terrified child who had cowered in livestock auctions, but a young man discovering the strength that came from choosing to stand rather than run. He had insisted on staying in the main room despite Eleanor's attempts to secure him in an upstairs suite. And now he methodically cleaned and loaded spare rifles with the precise movements Nathaniel had taught him during their brief time at the ranch. "You don't have to do this, son," Nathaniel said quietly, settling beside Benjamin on the makeshift ammunition crate that served as their bench. "There are enough men here to handle Dalton and Cross. You could wait upstairs with your grandmother. Let the adults finish this fight." Benjamin's storm-gray eyes met Nathaniel's with a clarity that seemed far older than his 11 years. "I've been waiting for 5 years for someone else to finish this fight. Waiting in darkness, waiting in fear, waiting for Uncle Cornelius to decide whether I lived or died." He set down the rifle he'd been loading and looked around the ballroom at the assembled defenders. "These men are here because they believe I'm worth protecting. The least I can do is prove them right." Eleanor approached from across the room, having just finished coordinating with Marshal Patterson about defensive positions. Despite the danger, despite the makeshift nature of their fortress, she moved with the regal bearing of someone who had spent decades commanding boardrooms and bending powerful men to her will. But when she looked at her grandson, her expression softened with a grandmother's infinite love. "Benjamin, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly," she said, settling her silk skirts with practiced grace as she joined them on the ammunition crates. "After tonight, after we've dealt with these last threats from your uncle's network, what do you want? Do you want to come back to Boston with me? Resume your education at the finest schools, take your place in society as the Ashford heir?" The question hung in the ballroom air like smoke from gunpowder, heavy with implications for everyone present. Nathaniel felt his chest tighten as he waited for Benjamin's answer, knowing that either response would fundamentally change the course of his life. If the boy chose Boston and privilege, Nathaniel would return to his lonely ranch and the echoing silence of a house meant for a family. If Benjamin chose to stay in Montana, Eleanor might never forgive the rough frontiersman who had stolen her grandson's affection. Benjamin considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, his small hands folding in his lap as he weighed responsibilities against desires, duty against love. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the wisdom of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly, but had somehow retained the essential goodness of childhood. "Grandmother Eleanor," he said carefully, "I've learned something important during these past days with Nathaniel. Family isn't just about blood or money or social position. It's about who chooses to stand beside you when the darkness comes calling." He looked directly at both adults, his gaze steady and sure. "You traveled across a continent to find me, risked everything to bring me home. Nathaniel risked his life to protect a stranger's child because it was the right thing to do." Eleanor's eyes misted with tears she refused to let fall, recognizing the steel beneath her grandson's gentle words. "And what does that mean for your future, child? What does that mean for us?" Benjamin smiled then, the first truly joyful expression any of them had seen from him since the livestock auction. "It means I want both my families. I want to spend winters in Boston, learning about business and culture and all the things an Ashford heir should know. but I want to spend summers here in Montana, learning about horses and cattle and what it means to work with your hands." He reached out to take both their hands in his small ones. "Is that possible? Can I belong to both worlds?" Before either adult could answer, Scout began barking frantically from his position near the main entrance. Through the barricaded windows they could see torches moving in the darkness beyond Helena's main street. Dalton and Cross had arrived, and they hadn't come alone. At least a dozen men moved through the shadows, more gunfighters recruited from the saloons and gambling halls where desperate men gathered to drink away their failures. Marshal Patterson appeared beside their makeshift command position, his weathered face grim with tactical assessment. "They're not trying to be subtle about this. Looks like they plan to storm the place directly, counting on superior numbers to overwhelm our defenses." He checked his rifle one final time, the motion automatic after decades of frontier law enforcement. "Mrs. Ashford, last chance to reconsider moving the boy to safety." But Eleanor Ashford had not built a railroad empire by backing down from fights, and she certainly wasn't going to start now when her grandson's life hung in the balance. "Marshal, my grandson has made his choice to stand and fight. As his family, our job is to ensure he survives to see the consequences of that courage." She drew a small pearl-handled pistol from her reticule, checking the chambers with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to protect herself in a man's world. "I didn't travel 2,000 miles to lose him now." The first shot shattered the hotel's front windows like crystalline thunder, followed immediately by the war cries of desperate men with nothing left to lose. Dalton and Cross had learned from their employers' mistakes, bringing enough firepower to simply overwhelm any defense through sheer volume of violence. But they had underestimated the determination of people fighting for family rather than money. Nathaniel took position at the eastern windows, his rifle speaking with the measured authority of a man who had learned marksmanship at Gettysburg and perfected it during long Montana winters, hunting for survival. Each shot was deliberate, economical, deadly, the kind of shooting that came from understanding that ammunition was precious and every bullet had to count. Eleanor surprised everyone by proving herself equally deadly with her small pistol, her shots picking off attackers who thought an elderly woman would be easy prey. Years of shooting at her private range in Boston had prepared her for this moment, though she had never imagined using those skills to protect her grandson from hired killers. Benjamin, despite his youth, proved invaluable as a loader and spotter, his sharp eyes tracking movement in the darkness and calling out positions to the defenders. The mathematical precision that had marked him as unusual during the livestock auction now served a deadlier purpose as he calculated angles and distances with uncanny accuracy. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably less than 30 minutes. When the last of the gun smoke cleared and the final echo of gunfire faded into the Montana night, 6 attackers lay dead in Helena's main street, and 3 more had fled into the darkness rather than face the concentrated firepower of the hotel's defenders. Dalton and Cross would never threaten anyone again, their bodies testament to the price of underestimating a grandmother's love and a frontiersman's determination. The last threads of Cornelius Ashford's conspiracy had been cut, leaving Benjamin finally, truly free to choose his own future. As dawn broke over the Montana territory, painting the mountains in shades of gold and promise, Eleanor Ashford made a decision that would have shocked Boston society, but felt perfectly natural in the clarity of the morning light. "Mr. Riverstone," she said formally, though her eyes twinkled with something that might have been mischief, "I believe I have a business proposition for you." Family, as Benjamin had wisely observed, was indeed about who chose to stand beside you when darkness came calling. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that family grew larger rather than smaller as the battles ended and the healing began. To our listeners, who remember what it means to fight for family, do you have someone in your life who proved their love not through words, but by standing beside you when everything seemed hopeless. Have you ever discovered that the family you choose can be just as precious as the family you're born into? Share your stories in the comments below, because sometimes the most powerful families are built not on blood, but on the courage to love unconditionally.